The phone rang at 11 at night, and Eleanor Vance almost let it go to voicemail. She was folding laundry on her narrow apartment bed, tired from a double shift at the diner, when the screen lit up with a number she did not recognize. Something made her answer. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the strange feeling that had been sitting in her chest all day, the sense that something was about to change. A man's voice, formal and a little shaky, asked if he was speaking with Eleanor Vance, formerly Eleanor Ashford. She sat up straight. She had not used that last name in 3 years, not since the divorce papers were signed, and she had walked out of a marriage that had worn her down to nothing. The man introduced himself as Victor Hale, a lawyer representing the estate of Richard Ashford. Eleanor's fingers went cold around the phone. Richard was her former father-in-law. She had not spoken to him since the divorce, though she still thought of him sometimes. The quiet man who used to bring her tea on the porch while his son yelled at her inside the house. Victor Hale told her that Richard had passed away 4 days earlier. Heart failure, sudden, peaceful in his sleep. Eleanor felt a strange ache. Grief, for a man she barely had the right to grieve anymore. Then Victor said the words that would change the next year of her life. Richard had left her the estate. Not a portion of it. Not a token gift out of guilt. All of it. Ashford Hall, the house, the land, the outbuildings. Everything that had been in the Ashford family for 4 generations had been signed over to Eleanor Vance in a will, updated only 2 months before his death. She asked him to repeat it, because she was certain she had misheard. He repeated it, slower this time, the way people speak when they know the news is too large to land the first time. The house Richard Ashford had raised his children in. The house his own father had built. The house his son Nathaniel had grown up believing was his birthright. Eleanor sat frozen on the edge of her bed. Somewhere down the hall, a neighbor's television murmured through the wall, the sound flattening out into background noise as her mind tried to catch up. She asked if Nathaniel knew. Victor Hale was quiet for a moment, and then said that the family had been informed that morning, and that they were not taking it well. That single sentence sent a small, cold current through her stomach. She knew exactly what not taking it well meant when it came to the Ashfords. She had lived inside that family long enough to understand their silence could be sharper than their shouting. She barely slept that night. She lay staring at the ceiling, replaying moments from years ago, quiet dinners where Richard would ask about her day before anyone else in the family thought to. She remembered how he used to walk with her through the garden at the estate, while Nathaniel stayed inside on the phone, too busy to notice his wife needed someone to talk to. She remembered how Richard had once told her, almost like an apology on someone else's behalf, that his son did not know how to hold on to good things. At the time, she had thought it was just a kind old man trying to smooth over an uncomfortable moment. Now those words felt like a message he had been building toward for years. By morning, her phone would not stop buzzing. The first call was from Nathaniel. She let it ring out. The second call was from his sister, Charlotte, a woman who had never once, in 5 years of marriage, called Eleanor without an ulterior motive. She let that ring out too. Then came a message from Nathaniel that she did read, because curiosity got the better of her nerves. The message accused her of manipulating a dying old man. It called her calculating, dishonest, a woman who had wormed her way into an inheritance she had no right to touch. It ended with a threat wrapped in legal language, a promise that the will would be challenged and overturned before she ever set foot on the property. Eleanor put the phone face down on the counter and stared out her kitchen window at the gray morning light. She had built a small, quiet life since the divorce. A modest apartment, a steady but unglamorous job, a short list of people she trusted, none of whom were named Ashford. She had not asked for this inheritance. She had not spoken to Richard in years, except for a single phone call on her birthday, when he called just to say he hoped she was doing well. Now she was being pulled back into a family that had never wanted her, holding a gift she had never requested, standing in the middle of a fight that had already started without her. She called Victor Hale back that afternoon, her voice steadier than she felt. She wanted to know what her options were. He explained gently that legally, the will was hers to accept or refuse. If she refused, the estate would likely pass through a lengthy court process, possibly ending up back with the Ashford children after all, though not without a fight among themselves as well, since none of them fully trusted one another either. If she accepted, she would become the sole owner of a property that, according to Victor, had not been properly maintained in over a decade. Eleanor asked what that meant exactly. Victor hesitated. The kind of hesitation lawyers use when they do not want to be the one to deliver bad news outright. He said the house had suffered significant decline, weather damage, some structural concerns. He used the word livable in a tone that suggested it barely qualified. She thanked him for his honesty and told him she needed a few days to think. That night, she dug through an old box in her closet, one she had not opened since the divorce. Photographs mostly, a few letters, ticket stubs from a life she used to share with a man who no longer resembled the person she thought she married. Near the bottom, she found a photograph that made her stop breathing for a second. It was her and Richard, sitting together on the porch of the estate, teacups in hand, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. She did not remember who had taken the photo. She did not remember what had been so funny, but she remembered the feeling of that afternoon, one of the only times in her marriage she had felt truly at ease. She sat on her apartment floor with that photograph in her hands for a long time. The next call she made was not to Victor Hale. It was to her closest friend, Grace Whitmore, a woman who had stood beside her through the entire divorce, and never once told her what to do, only asked good questions. Eleanor explained everything, the will, the estate, the threats already piling up in her inbox. Grace listened without interrupting, then asked the one question that mattered most. She asked Eleanor what she wanted, not what the Ashfords wanted her to do, not what would be easiest, but what she actually wanted. Eleanor did not have an answer that night, but something in her had already begun to shift. Over the following days, the pressure only grew heavier. Nathaniel showed up outside her apartment building uninvited, standing near his car with his arms crossed, waiting for her to come out. She refused to open the door until he left. Charlotte sent a long message, accusing her of being cruel to a grieving family, conveniently ignoring the fact that none of them had spoken to their father in the final years of his life, while Eleanor, despite everything, had at least called him on his birthday. A third sibling, a younger brother named Edward, took a different approach. He sent a quiet message, almost apologetic, saying he did not agree with how his siblings were handling things, but he still hoped she would consider selling the estate quickly so the family could split whatever money came from it. Even the gentle approach carried the same expectation underneath it, that the house was somehow rightfully theirs, no matter what the will said. Eleanor began to notice a pattern. Not one of them asked how she was doing. Not one of them acknowledged that she might be grieving too, in her own complicated way. All they saw was property. All they saw was money slipping out of their hands and into the hands of the woman they had spent years dismissing as an outsider. That realization did something to her. It did not make her angry exactly, not at first. It made her still. Still in a way she had not felt in years. The kind of stillness that comes right before someone stops asking permission to take up space in their own life. She met with Victor Hale in person the following week, at a small office downtown, with paper-thin walls and the smell of old coffee. He laid out the paperwork in front of her, the details of the estate, its history, and the will itself. Richard's handwriting appeared in the margins of an early draft, notes he had clearly written and rewritten. One line, crossed out twice before it was finally kept, caught her eye. It read that Eleanor Vance had shown him more genuine kindness in a single afternoon than his own children had shown him in years, and that the house deserved someone who understood the value of things worth keeping. She read that line 3 times. Victor gave her space to sit with it, then gently reminded her that whatever she decided, she needed to decide soon, because the Ashford family's legal team was already preparing to file a challenge. Eleanor left his office that afternoon without giving him an answer, but she drove, instead of taking the bus home, renting a car for the day, almost on impulse. She did not tell herself where she was going. She simply found herself turning onto the long, tree-lined road that led toward the estate, a road she had not driven down in over 3 years. The gate came into view before the house did, tall iron bars rusted at the hinges, the name Ashford Estate still engraved across the top in letters that had once gleamed and now sat dull and neglected. The gate was slightly open, as if no one had bothered to lock it in a long time. Beyond it, the driveway disappeared into overgrown brush, the house barely visible through the tangle of ivy and untrimmed trees. Eleanor parked just outside the gate and stepped out of the car, her heart pounding, for reasons she could not fully explain. The wind moved through the trees with a low, steady sound, almost like the house itself was breathing. For a long moment, she simply stood there, staring at the name on the gate, thinking about every version of herself who had once walked through it. The nervous young woman, marrying into a family that never fully accepted her. The tired wife trying to hold together something that had already begun cracking. The woman who left with nothing but a suitcase and her own name. And now, somehow, she stood here again, being handed a piece of a story she had once been erased from. She did not go inside that day. She simply stood at the gate for nearly 20 minutes, her hand resting on the cold iron bars, staring down the driveway at the shape of the house barely visible in the distance. Something about the silence around her did not feel empty. It felt like waiting. As she turned to leave, her phone buzzed once more. Another message from Nathaniel, shorter this time, colder. It told her she had no right to any of it and that she would regret ever stepping foot back onto Ashford land. Eleanor read the message twice, standing there in the fading light, with the gate still visible behind her in the rearview mirror as she drove away. She felt something settle inside her chest, quiet but certain. She did not know yet whether she would keep the house, restore it, or walk away entirely, but she knew one thing, with complete clarity, as she drove back toward the small apartment that had never quite felt like home. She was done being told what she deserved by people who had never once asked what she wanted. Whatever came next, she would decide it herself. 3 days after standing at the gate, Eleanor received a certified letter that made her stomach drop before she even opened the envelope. It was from a law firm she did not recognize, representing Nathaniel and Charlotte jointly. The letter stated their intention to formally contest Richard Ashford's will, citing undue influence and questioning his mental competency in the final months of his life. The words on the page were careful, clinical, but the intent behind them was anything but gentle. They were building a case to prove Eleanor had manipulated a dying man into signing away a family legacy. She read the letter twice at her kitchen table, then set it down and pressed her palms flat against the wood surface, steadying herself. Grace Whitmore came over that evening after a quick phone call, arriving with a bag of takeout and a look of quiet determination on her face. Grace read the letter herself, frowning deeper with every line. She asked Eleanor plainly whether she intended to fight this, or simply walk away and let the Ashfords have what they wanted. Eleanor sat with the question longer than she expected to. Walking away would be easier. It would mean no lawyers, no more messages from Nathaniel, no more strangers questioning her character in a courtroom. It would mean going back to her small, quiet life. But something in her refused to let that be the answer. She thought about the crossed-out line in Richard's own handwriting, the one Victor Hale had shown her, about kindness and things worth keeping. She thought about how easily the Ashford siblings assumed she would simply hand it all back the moment they pushed hard enough. She told Grace she was not walking away, not because she desperately wanted the house, but because she refused to let people who had never respected her decide what she was capable of holding on to. The next morning, she called Victor Hale and told him to prepare her response. He sounded almost relieved, admitting that Richard had predicted this exact fight might happen and had left behind additional documentation, specifically to protect Eleanor's position. Victor mentioned a sealed letter Richard had written, meant to be opened only if the will was formally challenged. Eleanor asked why she was only hearing about this now. Victor explained gently that Richard's instructions were precise. The letter was to remain unopened unless a legal challenge was actually filed, not simply threatened. Now that the papers had arrived, the condition had been met. They met again in his cramped office 2 days later. Victor slid a plain envelope across the desk, Richard's handwriting steady across the front, addressed simply to Eleanor. She opened it slowly, aware of Victor's polite silence as he pretended to organize other files nearby. The letter was longer than she expected. Richard wrote about the years he had spent watching his children grow into people who valued possessions over relationships, arguments over patience. He wrote about how he had noticed, quietly and without saying anything at the time, the difference in how Eleanor treated him during family gatherings, compared to how his own children treated him. He described specific memories, small moments Eleanor had nearly forgotten. A rainy afternoon when she stayed inside with him, playing cards instead of joining the rest of the family at an event he had been too tired to attend. A birthday she remembered when none of his own children called. He wrote that leaving her the estate was not an act of charity, nor was it meant to punish his children, though he understood they would see it that way. It was, in his words, an act of correcting a mistake he had let happen for far too long. a mistake of allowing kindness in his family to go unrewarded, while entitlement was allowed to flourish unchecked. The final paragraph asked her, if she chose to keep the estate, to do something meaningful with it, not for him, but for herself. He wrote that the house had been trapped for years, under the weight of a family that no longer appreciated it, and that it deserved to belong to someone who understood the value of rebuilding things. Eleanor folded the letter carefully and placed it back into its envelope, her hands trembling slightly. Victor asked if she was all right. She nodded, though the honest answer was more complicated than a simple yes. The letter became part of her legal defense, though Victor was careful to explain that its emotional weight mattered far less in court than the paperwork surrounding Richard's mental state at the time of the will's signing. Medical records would need to be gathered, statements from his physician, testimony from anyone who had spent time with him in his final months. This was where the fight became uglier than Eleanor expected. Nathaniel's legal team began reaching out to people who had known Richard, twisting simple observations into suggestions of confusion or memory lapses. A neighbor who once mentioned Richard occasionally forgot where he placed his keys was quoted as evidence of cognitive decline. A caretaker who visited twice a week to help with groceries was pressured into implying Richard may have been easily influenced, though she later clarified to Eleanor privately that her words had been taken out of context entirely. Eleanor felt the walls closing in during those weeks. She barely slept, splitting her time between her regular job and endless calls with Victor's office, gathering whatever evidence she could to counter the growing narrative that painted her as a woman who had schemed her way into a fortune. Grace stayed close through it all, sometimes simply sitting with her in silence after a hard day, other times pushing her gently to keep going, when exhaustion made quitting seem tempting. One evening, after a particularly draining call with Victor about scheduling depositions, Eleanor broke down at her kitchen table, the pressure of months finally cracking through her composure. Grace did not try to fix it with words. She simply sat beside her, letting her cry, until Eleanor finally admitted the fear she had been carrying quietly this whole time. She was afraid that if she lost this fight, it would prove the Ashfords right, that she really had been nothing more than an outsider who never belonged in that family, someone easily discarded once she was no longer useful. Grace told her something that stuck with her long after that night. She said the Ashfords were not afraid of losing a house. They were afraid of what it meant that their own father chose a woman they had spent years disrespecting over his own children. That fear, Grace said, was the real reason behind every ugly letter, every twisted statement, every threat disguised as concern for the family legacy. Eleanor carried those words into the following weeks like armor. The deposition process began not long after. Eleanor sat across from Nathaniel's lawyer, a sharp-featured man who tried repeatedly to paint her marriage to Nathaniel as the origin point of some long game she had been playing for years, waiting patiently for a payout through his father's estate. Eleanor answered every question calmly, refusing to let his tone rattle her composure, even as questions grew more personal and more invasive. At one point, the lawyer asked why she had never remarried, implying it fit a pattern of someone unwilling to move on from a wealthy family connection. Eleanor met his eyes directly and answered that she had simply been rebuilding her life on her own terms, something she doubted he could understand, given how much of his questioning depended on assuming women could not exist without attaching themselves to someone else's fortune. The room went quiet for a moment. Victor, sitting beside her, allowed the faintest hint of a smile before regaining his neutral expression. Nathaniel himself was called to testify as well. Eleanor sat through his deposition from the other side of the room, listening as he described his father in increasingly manufactured terms, painting Richard as frail and easily led during his final year, despite having barely visited him during that same period. At one point, under pressure from Victor's cross-examination, Nathaniel admitted he had not seen his father in person for nearly 5 months before his death, a fact that visibly weakened the family's narrative of concern and closeness. Charlotte's testimony fared even worse. She struggled to answer basic questions about her father's daily routine, medications, or recent conversations, revealing just how disconnected she truly was from his final months. Edward, the youngest sibling, was noticeably absent from much of the legal proceedings, having quietly distanced himself from his older sibling's aggressive approach. Weeks passed in this exhausting rhythm of depositions, paperwork, and mounting legal fees that Eleanor had never anticipated needing to worry about. She dipped into savings she had carefully built since the divorce, telling herself this fight was worth the cost, even on nights when doubt crept back in. Then, one afternoon, Victor called with unexpected news. The judge overseeing the case had reviewed the medical records, Richard's own written letter, and the testimony gathered so far, and had scheduled a hearing to determine whether the challenge to the will held enough merit to proceed to a full trial. Eleanor sat in the courthouse hallway on the day of that hearing, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching Nathaniel and Charlotte whisper to each other on the opposite side of the room. When the judge finally spoke, delivering a ruling that dismissed the challenge for lack of sufficient evidence regarding undue influence or incompetency, Eleanor felt the tension in her shoulders release all at once, like a breath she had been holding for months finally escaping. Nathaniel's face went pale. Charlotte stormed out without a word. Victor placed a steady hand on Eleanor's shoulder, offering quiet congratulations, though he reminded her the family could still appeal, dragging the process out longer if they chose to. Eleanor barely registered the warning in that moment. For the first time since the entire ordeal began, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. That evening, she drove back to the gate of Ashford Estate alone, without planning to. She parked outside once more, staring at the tall iron bars and the name still etched above them. This time, instead of simply standing outside, she reached forward and pushed the gate open, the metal groaning against rusted hinges as it swung wide. She walked a few steps down the overgrown driveway, further than she had gone before, until the house came fully into view through the tangled branches. It stood tall despite its neglect, windows dark and broken in places, ivy crawling up its stone walls like it was slowly trying to reclaim the structure back into the earth. Eleanor stood there a long time, staring at the house that was now legally, undeniably hers. She did not smile this time. She simply nodded once, quietly, as if agreeing to something unspoken between herself and the crumbling building in front of her. Whatever came next would not be easy. But for the first time since Victor Hale's first phone call weeks earlier, Eleanor felt something steady settle inside her chest. She was staying. The sound of her own footsteps on the gravel driveway felt strange to Eleanor, too loud in the silence surrounding Ashford Hall. She had come back the following weekend with a flashlight, a notebook, and a determination to see the inside of the house for the first time in years, ready or not. The front door stuck when she pushed against it, swollen from years of moisture, and she had to throw her shoulder into it twice before it finally gave way with a groan. Dust hung thick in the air of the entrance hall, catching the weak afternoon light, spilling through a broken window near the staircase. She stepped inside carefully, her shoes crunching over fallen plaster and scattered leaves that had blown in through gaps in the frame. The house smelled of damp wood and neglect, a scent that seemed to seep into her clothes within minutes. She moved slowly through the ground floor, flashlight beams sweeping across water-stained walls and warped floorboards. The grand staircase, once the pride of the estate according to old family photographs, now sagged dangerously on one side, several steps missing entirely where rot had eaten through the wood. She found the parlor where she used to sit with Richard, the room where that old photograph had likely been taken. The furniture remained, covered in thick white sheets that had yellowed with age, shapes barely recognizable beneath the dust. She pulled one sheet back gently, revealing the same worn armchair Richard used to sit in, its fabric faded but intact. Eleanor sat down slowly onto the edge of that chair, ignoring the dust that rose around her, and allowed herself a long moment of stillness in the quiet room. Eventually she continued her exploration, moving toward the east wing, the part of the house Victor had warned her about during their earlier conversations. The moment she stepped through the doorway connecting the two sections, she understood immediately why he had been so careful with his words. The ceiling had partially collapsed here, sunlight streaming through a gaping hole above, rain damage having rotted through support beams over what must have been years of unchecked exposure. Debris covered the floor in piles, furniture crushed beneath fallen plaster and wooden beams. She stood at the threshold, unwilling to risk stepping further into a section that looked one strong wind away from collapsing entirely. She backed away carefully, making a mental note in her notebook, the first of what would become a long and growing list of urgent repairs. The kitchen fared slightly better, though cabinets hung open on broken hinges, and the old stove sat rusted beyond any hope of use. Upstairs, several bedrooms remained mostly intact, protected somewhat by their distance from the worst water damage, though every room carried the same heavy layer of dust and disuse. She found Richard's old study last, a room she remembered visiting only once or twice during her marriage, always feeling like she was intruding on a private space reserved for him alone. Now, standing in the doorway, she noticed his desk remained exactly as it must have been left, papers still scattered across its surface, an old fountain pen resting beside a stack of letters tied together with faded ribbon. She approached carefully, running her fingers over the edge of the desk, before finally sitting down in his old chair. The letters, once untied, revealed correspondence between Richard and old friends, business partners, even a few notes from Eleanor herself, sent years earlier. Simple messages checking in on him during her marriage, ones she barely remembered writing. Tucked among them was a folded piece of paper that caught her attention immediately, different from the rest. It was a rough sketch, hand-drawn, showing the layout of the estate grounds with several sections marked and labeled in Richard's familiar handwriting. Notes beside certain areas mentioned ideas for restoration, thoughts on rebuilding the garden, converting part of the east wing into something new entirely. Eleanor stared at that sketch for a long time, understanding slowly that Richard himself had once imagined bringing this house back to life, though he never found the means or the will to actually do it during his lifetime. She folded the paper carefully and placed it into her bag, deciding immediately she would keep it close throughout whatever came next. Over the following days, Eleanor returned to the estate repeatedly, each visit revealing new problems, alongside small, unexpected discoveries. She found an old greenhouse behind the main house, its glass panels mostly shattered, but its iron frame still standing solid, despite years of neglect. She found a family photo album hidden in a closet upstairs, filled with pictures spanning decades, showing generations of Ashfords who had once filled these rooms with life, before slowly drifting away from the house entirely. She hired a structural inspector recommended by Victor, a stern but thorough man named Henry Cole, who walked the property alongside her, pointing out problems with blunt honesty that Eleanor appreciated more than gentle reassurance would have offered. Henry explained that the east wing required either extensive reconstruction or complete demolition, that the roof across most of the house needed replacement, and that foundational issues near the northern corner would need immediate attention before any cosmetic work could even begin. He handed her a rough estimate that made her sit down on the porch steps in stunned silence. The number was larger than anything she had imagined, larger than her entire savings account by a significant margin. Henry, noticing her reaction, softened his tone slightly, telling her that despite the damage, the house's bones remained remarkably strong for its age. Whoever built it, he said, had used quality materials and solid craftsmanship, the kind rarely seen in newer construction. If she was willing to commit the time and resources, the house could absolutely be saved, restored even to something better than it had been in decades. Eleanor thanked him for his honesty, though privately she wondered if she was capable of taking on something this massive. That night, back in her small apartment, she spread out every piece of paperwork across her living room floor. Repair estimates, structural reports, Richard's old sketch of the grounds. She sat among it all, overwhelmed, questioning whether keeping the estate had been the right decision after all, whether she had fought so hard through the legal battle, only to inherit an impossible burden. Grace visited again that evening, taking one look at the scattered papers before sitting down across from her with a steady, patient expression. She asked Eleanor to walk her through everything, the costs, the damage, the timeline Henry had suggested. Eleanor explained it all, her voice growing quieter with every added detail, the weight of the numbers pressing down harder the longer she spoke. When she finished, Grace asked a simple question that cut straight through the noise in Eleanor's head. She asked whether Eleanor wanted to save the house, separate entirely from whether it made financial sense. Eleanor sat with that question for a long moment before answering honestly. Yes, she wanted to save it. Not because of the money it represented, not to spite the Ashford siblings, but because something about standing inside those broken walls had stirred a feeling she had not experienced in years, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations of her. Grace nodded, satisfied with the answer, then asked the practical question that followed naturally. If she wanted to save it, what was stopping her from finding a way to make it happen, piece by piece, rather than trying to solve the entire massive project all at once? That reframing shifted something in Eleanor's mind. She had been treating the restoration as one impossible mountain to climb in a single attempt. Instead, she began breaking it down that same night, prioritizing the most urgent structural issues first, researching loan options, considering which parts of the house could wait, and which required immediate attention to prevent further damage. She called her bank the following morning, inquiring about a renovation loan against the estate's value. The process felt intimidating, filled with paperwork and appraisals, but Victor helped guide her through much of it, having handled enough estate matters over the years to understand the practical steps involved in turning inherited property into something workable. Weeks passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and mounting exhaustion, but slowly, piece by piece, Eleanor assembled a plan. She secured a loan large enough to address the most critical repairs. She began interviewing contractors, most of whom quoted prices far beyond what she could afford, until Henry Cole recommended someone he trusted personally, a man named Marcus Bell, who specialized in restoring older properties, rather than simply patching them for resale value. Their first meeting took place on site, standing together in front of the collapsed section of the east wing. Marcus walked the property slowly, running his hands along damaged beams, crouching to inspect foundation cracks, asking sharp, thoughtful questions about the history of the house, rather than simply focusing on the numbers involved. Eleanor found herself explaining more than she expected to: the story of Richard, the will, the legal battle she had just come through. Marcus listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, clearly more interested in understanding the full picture than rushing toward a quick estimate. When he finally offered his assessment, his price came in lower than every other contractor she had spoken with, though he was careful to explain that lower cost did not mean lower quality. He believed, he said, in matching the effort to the meaning behind a project, and something about the story of this house told him this restoration meant more than a simple business transaction. Eleanor studied him carefully as he spoke, sensing genuine sincerity behind his words, rather than a sales tactic. She agreed to move forward with him the following week, signing a contract that would mark the true beginning of the estate's transformation. That night, standing once again at the iron gate as the sun set behind the tree line, Eleanor allowed herself a small, tired smile. The road ahead remained long and uncertain, filled with challenges she could not yet fully predict. But for the first time since Richard's lawyer first called her weeks earlier, she felt something closer to hope than fear settling into her chest. The house was still broken, but so was she once, in her own way, and she had found her way back from that too. She believed, standing there in the fading light, that the same might be possible for Ashford Hall. Work on the estate began on a cold morning in early spring, with Marcus Bell arriving in a battered truck loaded with tools, and a small crew of workers he had hand-picked over years of similar projects. Eleanor stood at the edge of the driveway, watching them unload equipment, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and terror, as the reality of what she had committed to finally settled in. The first weeks focused entirely on stabilization, rather than restoration. Marcus explained that before anything beautiful could happen, they needed to secure the bones of the house, reinforcing the foundation near the northern corner, replacing rotted support beams in the roof, and carefully bracing what remained of the east wing to prevent further collapse, while they assessed whether any part of it could be saved. Eleanor spent most days on site, unable to stay away, even when there was little she could physically contribute. She learned quickly that restoration work involved far more waiting and problem-solving than the fast, satisfying transformations she had imagined. Entire days passed, dealing with unexpected complications. A support beam, more damaged than initial inspections suggested. Wiring throughout the house, so outdated, it posed genuine fire risks. Plumbing, that needed complete replacement rather than simple repair. Despite the setbacks, she found herself drawn into the rhythm of the work, learning the names of tools she had never used before, picking up simple tasks Marcus's crew were happy to teach her when she asked. She spent afternoons clearing debris alongside the workers, hauling broken furniture and collapsed plaster into a growing pile near the edge of the property, her hands developing calluses she had never had during her years working at the diner. Marcus proved to be more than just a skilled contractor. He carried a quiet patience that Eleanor found herself appreciating more with each passing week. He never rushed her decisions, always explaining options clearly when it came to choices about materials or design, respecting that this was her house and her vision, guiding the process, even when he clearly had strong opinions of his own about certain approaches. One afternoon, while clearing out the old greenhouse behind the main house, Eleanor discovered a small metal box buried beneath a collapsed shelving unit. Inside, she found a collection of old letters, along with several photographs she had never seen before. Marcus, noticing her sudden stillness, walked over and crouched beside her, asking gently what she had found. She showed him the photographs first, images of a much younger Richard standing proudly in front of the newly built greenhouse, along with a woman Eleanor recognized as his late wife, someone who had passed away long before Eleanor ever married into the family. The letters, written between the couple during a period of separation early in their marriage, revealed a side of Richard's history that Eleanor had never known existed. The letters spoke of financial struggles, family disagreements, and a period when the estate had nearly been sold entirely due to debt accumulated by Richard's own father. Richard's wife had written passionately about refusing to give up the house, insisting that some things carried value beyond money, worth fighting to protect even when logic suggested otherwise. Eleanor sat with those letters for a long time, feeling an unexpected connection to a woman she had never met, someone who had apparently loved this house with the same stubborn determination Eleanor now found herself carrying. She shared parts of the discovery with Marcus, who listened thoughtfully, before commenting that houses like this one seemed to attract people willing to fight for them, generation after generation, regardless of how impractical that fight might appear to outsiders looking in from a distance. As the weeks progressed, word of the restoration slowly spread through the small town nearby. Eleanor began noticing curious glances whenever she stopped at the local grocery store or filled her car with gas, townspeople clearly aware of the ongoing drama between her and the Ashford family that had played out in headlines during the legal battle months earlier. One afternoon, an older woman approached her outside the hardware store, introducing herself as Lucy Bennett, someone who had known Richard for decades through the local community center where he used to volunteer occasionally in his younger years. Lucy expressed genuine warmth toward Eleanor, telling her she was glad someone finally intended to bring life back into that old house, rather than letting it rot away entirely or fall into the hands of developers looking to tear it down for profit. That brief conversation stayed with Eleanor throughout the following days, a small reminder that beyond the Ashford family drama, an entire community held its own memories and connections to this property. Memories she was slowly beginning to understand went far deeper than she had initially realized. Not every interaction in town carried the same warmth, however. Nathaniel's presence lingered even in his physical absence. Rumors and opinions about the ongoing situation clearly having spread through certain circles that remained loyal to the Ashford name out of old family connections or business relationships. A man at the local diner once made a pointed comment within earshot about outsiders taking what did not belong to them, clearly aimed at Eleanor, though never addressed to her directly. She learned to let such comments pass without engaging, focusing her energy instead on the work in front of her, rather than the opinions of people who knew nothing about the actual story behind her inheritance. Meanwhile, structural progress on the house continued steadily. The roof repairs finished ahead of schedule, thanks largely to unusually dry weather that spring, allowing Marcus's crew to move quickly, without the delays that rain often caused on similar projects. The foundation work near the northern corner proved more complicated than initially estimated, requiring additional reinforcement that pushed costs higher than Eleanor's original loan had accounted for. She found herself facing difficult financial decisions during this period, ultimately deciding to take on additional work herself, picking up extra shifts at a nearby restaurant during evenings when construction work wound down for the day. The exhaustion of balancing physical labor at the estate with paid work elsewhere began to wear on her, though she refused to let it show whenever Marcus or his crew asked how she was holding up. One evening, after a particularly grueling day involving both estate work and a late shift at the restaurant, Eleanor arrived home to find Marcus waiting outside her apartment building, something she had not expected. He explained apologetically that he had noticed her exhaustion building over recent weeks and wanted to check in, uncomfortable with simply ignoring it as though it were none of his business. Eleanor, too tired to maintain her usual guarded composure, admitted honestly that the financial pressure was becoming difficult to manage, that she worried constantly about running out of funds before the restoration reached a point where the house could sustain itself, whether through eventually opening it for tours or events. or simply becoming a stable home she could afford to maintain long-term. Marcus listened carefully, then offered a suggestion she had not considered. He mentioned a program he had worked with on previous historical restoration projects, a local heritage preservation grant available for properties with significant historical value within the region. Ashford Hall, given its age and architectural significance, likely qualified for funding that could ease some of the financial burden Eleanor currently carried alone. The suggestion sparked a renewed sense of hope, one that carried her through the following weeks, as she researched the grant program extensively, eventually submitting an application, alongside historical documentation Victor Hale helped her gather, regarding the estate's significance within the region's broader history. While waiting for a response regarding the grant, Eleanor continued working alongside Marcus's crew daily, slowly watching the house transform bit by bit. Walls once stained with water damage received fresh plaster. Windows long broken were carefully replaced with glass, matching the original architectural style. The grand staircase, once sagging dangerously, was rebuilt piece by piece, using reclaimed wood that Marcus sourced specifically to match the original craftsmanship as closely as possible. Despite the physical exhaustion and financial stress weighing on her throughout this period, Eleanor found herself experiencing moments of genuine joy she had not felt in years. Standing in the newly repaired parlor one afternoon, watching sunlight stream cleanly through freshly installed windows for the first time in over a decade, she felt tears well up unexpectedly, a mixture of relief, pride, and something close to gratitude toward a man who had given her this chance, despite everything his own family had done to push her away. That evening, sitting alone in the newly stabilized study where she had found Richard's old sketch weeks earlier, Eleanor pulled out her notebook and began sketching her own ideas for the house's future, building upon Richard's original vision while adding her own personal touches, small details that reflected who she had become since walking away from her marriage years earlier. She imagined the greenhouse rebuilt entirely, filled with plants she would choose herself. She imagined the east wing, once a symbol of the house's decline, transformed into something entirely new, perhaps a space for the local community, rather than simply another private wing of an already large house. For the first time since this entire journey began, Eleanor allowed herself to dream beyond simple survival, beyond the immediate need to stabilize and repair. She began imagining a genuine future here, one built entirely on her own terms. The grant approval letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked between bills and advertisements in Eleanor's regular mail delivery. She almost overlooked it entirely, until she noticed the official Heritage Preservation seal stamped across the envelope. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it, scanning the letter twice before the words fully registered. The application had been approved, granting funding that would cover a significant portion of the remaining restoration costs, particularly for work involving the historical accuracy of the house's architecture. Eleanor sat down heavily at her kitchen table, relief washing over her so completely that she found herself laughing quietly to an empty room, the sound almost foreign after months of tension and financial worry. She called Marcus immediately, sharing the news before she had even finished processing it herself. His genuine excitement on the other end of the line matched her own, and he suggested they celebrate that evening with a simple dinner near the estate, a small acknowledgement of how far they had come together since that first meeting in front of the collapsed East Wing months earlier. That evening, sitting across from Marcus at a quiet restaurant in town, Eleanor felt herself relaxing in a way she had not allowed herself in months. Their conversation drifted naturally from construction updates into more personal territory, Marcus sharing stories about his own path into restoration work, having grown up watching his father restore old furniture, before eventually shifting his focus toward entire buildings and homes. Eleanor found herself sharing more than she initially intended, describing her marriage to Nathaniel honestly for the first time, with someone outside her closest circle of friends. She spoke about the isolation she had felt during those years, the quiet dismissal she experienced from his family, and the strange, complicated grief she carried now, having lost the one person from that family who had actually seen her as a person worth caring about. Marcus listened without offering easy platitudes or forced sympathy, simply present in a way that made her feel genuinely heard rather than merely tolerated. When she finished, he shared quietly that he had noticed something different about her from their very first meeting, an underlying resilience beneath the exhaustion, something that told him this project meant far more to her than a simple financial inheritance. Their conversation that evening marked a subtle shift in their working relationship, though neither acknowledged it directly at the time. Over the following weeks, their partnership on the estate deepened into something that felt increasingly personal, built upon mutual respect and shared investment in seeing the house restored to its full potential. With the grant funding secured, restoration progress accelerated significantly. Marcus expanded his crew slightly, bringing on additional specialists for the more delicate architectural details Eleanor hoped to preserve throughout the house. A stonemason arrived to repair the original fireplace mantles scattered throughout several rooms. A glass specialist worked meticulously to restore stained glass windows in the upstairs hallway that Eleanor had not even realized existed until debris was cleared away, revealing intricate patterns hidden beneath years of grime and neglect. The East Wing, once considered a total loss, became the subject of lengthy discussion between Eleanor and Marcus. Structural engineers confirmed that while portions of the wing remained beyond saving, the original stone foundation and several key architectural elements could be preserved and incorporated into an entirely new design for that section of the house. Eleanor spent evenings researching architectural styles that complemented the estate's original construction, eventually deciding she wanted the rebuilt East Wing to serve a purpose beyond simple living space. Remembering her earlier conversation with Lucy Bennett at the hardware store, and thinking about Richard's own quiet connection to the local community center, Eleanor began imagining a space that could serve the town itself, perhaps a small gathering hall or event space that honored both the history of the estate and its place within the broader community. She brought this idea to Marcus one afternoon, half expecting him to point out the added complexity and cost such a vision would require. Instead, he grew visibly excited by the concept, immediately offering suggestions about how such a space could be designed to blend seamlessly with the original architecture, while still serving a distinctly modern purpose. Their collaborative planning sessions became a regular occurrence, evenings spent at Eleanor's kitchen table, surrounded by sketches, material samples, and blueprints Marcus had drafted based on their evolving conversations. What began as strictly professional planning gradually took on a warmer quality, punctuated by easy laughter and comfortable silences that Eleanor found herself looking forward to more than she cared to admit. Not everyone in Eleanor's life viewed this developing partnership with unconditional support. Grace, ever protective of her friend, raised gentle but pointed questions one evening, when Eleanor casually mentioned Marcus for what Grace pointed out was the fourth time in a single conversation. Eleanor found herself blushing slightly, admitting she had not fully considered what her growing feelings toward Marcus might mean, especially given how recently she had emerged from a difficult and painful marriage. Grace, to her credit, did not discourage the connection entirely, simply cautioning Eleanor to move at whatever pace felt right for her, without pressure from anyone, including herself. Eleanor appreciated the advice, recognizing the wisdom in taking things slowly, rather than rushing into anything before she had fully processed everything that had happened over the past several months. Meanwhile, tension with the Ashford family had not entirely disappeared, despite the earlier legal victory. Eleanor received occasional messages from Charlotte, each one carrying a slightly different tone than the last, sometimes bitter, other times almost pleading, as though Charlotte herself remained uncertain how to feel about losing what she had always assumed would eventually belong to her family. Nathaniel remained largely silent during this period, though Eleanor learned through mutual acquaintances that he had grown increasingly frustrated watching news of the restoration spread through their small community, unable to ignore the visible proof that Eleanor was successfully doing something he likely believed she never could. Edward, the youngest sibling, reached out again during this time, his message notably different from his previous communications. He mentioned that he had been thinking often about his father's final years, expressing genuine regret for not visiting more frequently before Richard's death. He asked, somewhat hesitantly, whether Eleanor might consider allowing him to visit the estate once restoration progressed further, expressing a desire to reconnect with memories of his childhood, rather than any interest in reclaiming ownership or profit from the property. Eleanor considered his request carefully before responding. Unlike his siblings, Edward's tone carried none of the entitlement or aggression she had grown accustomed to from the rest of the family. She replied cautiously, agreeing to allow a visit once the house reached a more stable point in its restoration, though she made clear this invitation extended only to him, not as an opening for renewed family claims over the property itself. As spring shifted into early summer, the transformation of Ashford Hall became increasingly visible, not just to Eleanor and Marcus's crew, but to the wider community as well. Curious townspeople occasionally stopped along the road bordering the estate, watching from a respectful distance as scaffolding came down from sections of the house where work had finished, revealing freshly restored stonework and gleaming windows that caught the afternoon sun in ways the house had not managed in decades. Lucy Bennet visited again one afternoon, this time walking directly up to the gate rather than simply passing by. Eleanor, noticing her from where she stood near the newly repaired greenhouse, walked over to greet her personally. Lucy expressed amazement at the visible progress, sharing more stories about Richard's earlier years, painting a fuller picture of a man who had clearly meant more to this community than his own children ever seemed to fully appreciate. That conversation planted a seed in Eleanor's mind that would grow steadily over the following weeks. She began envisioning not just a private restoration project, but something that could eventually give back to the community that had watched this house rise, fall, and now rise again. The vision for the rebuilt East Wing evolved further in her mind, taking shape as something meant explicitly to serve the town, a space for gatherings, celebrations, and connection that honored both Richard's memory and the genuine kindness she had witnessed from people like Lucy throughout this entire difficult process. By the time summer fully arrived, Eleanor stood one evening on the newly repaired porch, the same porch where she and Richard had once shared tea together years earlier. Marcus joined her after the crew had left for the day, both of them tired but satisfied after a long day of visible progress. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the newly cleared tree line, the estate finally beginning to resemble something whole again, rather than the crumbling ruin it had been just months earlier. Eleanor felt something settle deeply within her in that quiet moment, a sense of rightness about the path she had chosen, despite every obstacle that had tried to push her away from it. Edward Ashford arrived at the gate on a warm Saturday morning in early summer. Driving a modest sedan rather than the expensive car Eleanor remembered his siblings favoring during family gatherings years earlier. She watched him park just outside, hesitating a moment before stepping out, his eyes immediately drawn upward, toward the freshly repaired roofline visible above the tree line. Eleanor met him at the gate personally, exchanging a brief, somewhat awkward greeting, before leading him up the newly cleared driveway toward the house. Edward remained mostly quiet during the walk, his gaze drifting across familiar landmarks from his childhood. The old greenhouse now fitted with fresh glass panels, the garden beds Eleanor had begun clearing and replanting over recent weeks. When they reached the porch, Edward stopped walking entirely, staring up at the house with an expression Eleanor could not quite place. He admitted quietly that he had not expected it to look this different already, having assumed based on family conversations that the restoration was likely exaggerated or moving far slower than reports suggested. Eleanor invited him inside, guiding him through rooms that had been completed first, watching his reactions carefully as they moved from space to space. In the parlor, Edward paused beside the same armchair Eleanor had uncovered months earlier, running his fingers gently across the newly cleaned fabric. He shared quietly that this had been his father's favorite spot in the entire house, a detail Eleanor already suspected but appreciated hearing confirmed. Their conversation grew more open as the visit continued. Edward admitted, with visible discomfort, that he had spent the months following his father's death wrestling with guilt over how disconnected he had become from him in recent years, caught up in his own life, and assuming, wrongly, that there would always be more time to repair that distance later. Eleanor listened without judgment, recognizing in his words an honesty that had been entirely absent from her interactions with Nathaniel and Charlotte throughout the entire legal battle. She found herself sharing more with Edward than she initially planned, describing her own complicated relationship with grief over losing Richard, someone she had cared for deeply despite the strange, indirect nature of their connection, through a marriage that had otherwise ended painfully. By the end of the visit, something had shifted subtly between them. Edward thanked her sincerely for allowing him to see the house again, admitting he had feared, based on his siblings' descriptions of events, that Eleanor intended to erase every trace of the Ashford family from the property entirely. Standing in the freshly restored parlor, surrounded by preserved pieces of his childhood memories, he seemed to understand for the first time that her intentions had never been rooted in spite, but in something closer to genuine respect for what his father had built and hoped to preserve. Before leaving, Edward hesitated near the front door, then turned back to ask if he might visit again occasionally, not out of any claim to ownership, but simply to maintain a connection to memories that clearly still meant something important to him. Eleanor agreed, sensing genuine sincerity behind the request, marking the beginning of what would slowly become an unexpected, cautious friendship between them. News of Edward's visit inevitably reached Nathaniel and Charlotte, sparking renewed tension within the family, that Eleanor learned about secondhand, through occasional messages from Edward himself, who seemed increasingly willing to distance himself from his older siblings' ongoing bitterness. Charlotte accused him of betraying the family by cooperating with Eleanor, while Nathaniel reportedly refused to speak with him for several weeks following the incident. Eleanor felt a complicated mixture of guilt and relief regarding this fracture within the Ashford family, aware that her presence had inadvertently contributed to deeper divisions among siblings who clearly already struggled with unresolved resentments long before Richard's death ever brought these tensions fully into the open. Meanwhile, restoration work continued steadily through the summer months. The rebuilt East Wing began taking shape according to the vision Eleanor and Marcus had developed together, incorporating the salvaged stone foundation into a design that blended seamlessly with the original architecture, while creating an entirely new, open space intended for community gatherings. During this period, Eleanor also uncovered additional pieces of the estate's history hidden throughout various rooms as renovation progressed. Behind a false wall in the upstairs hallway, workers discovered a small hidden room, seemingly used decades earlier as a private study by Richard's own father, filled with old journals detailing the estate's early history and the reasoning behind its original construction. Eleanor spent several evenings reading through these journals, piecing together a fuller picture of the Ashford family across multiple generations. She learned that the estate had originally been built not simply as a display of wealth, but as a gathering place intended to serve the surrounding community during a period of significant regional growth, a detail that had clearly been lost or forgotten over subsequent generations as the family grew more insular and focused inward rather than outward. This discovery deepened Eleanor's resolve regarding her vision for the rebuilt East Wing, feeling as though she was not creating something entirely new, but rather restoring an original purpose the estate had once served long before it became a symbol of private family wealth and eventual neglect. She shared these journals with Marcus one evening, both of them poring over the pages together late into the night, discussing how certain original design elements mentioned within the old writings might be incorporated into the current restoration plans. Their collaborative energy during these sessions continued deepening the personal connection growing steadily between them, though both remained cautious about acknowledging it directly, aware of the complicated circumstances surrounding Eleanor's recent past. One evening, following a particularly long day working through complicated structural plans for the East Wing's new design, Marcus finally addressed the unspoken tension between them directly. He admitted, somewhat nervously, that his feelings toward her had grown beyond simple professional respect over recent months, though he understood if she needed more time before considering anything beyond their current working relationship. Eleanor sat quietly for a long moment, genuinely appreciating his honesty and the careful, patient way he had approached the subject, rather than pushing her before she felt ready. She admitted honestly that she had noticed similar feelings developing on her end as well, though she remained hesitant given how recently her marriage had ended and how much emotional weight she was still carrying from the entire ordeal surrounding Richard's inheritance. They agreed, mutually and without pressure, to continue building their connection slowly, allowing whatever existed between them to develop naturally alongside the ongoing restoration project, rather than rushing into anything neither of them felt fully prepared for. As summer progressed toward its later months, the estate continued its steady transformation. The rebuilt East Wing neared completion, its new design honoring both the original stone foundation and the community-focused purpose Eleanor had uncovered through Richard's father's old journals. Large windows lined the new structure, flooding the space with natural light, while an open floor plan created room for gatherings that could serve dozens of community members at once. Lucy Bennett, upon seeing the nearly finished space during one of her regular visits, expressed genuine emotion at witnessing the estate's transformation into something that could once again serve the wider community, rather than remaining isolated behind private family walls. She mentioned, somewhat hesitantly, that the local community center, where Richard had once volunteered, had recently lost its lease on their previous building, leaving them without a reliable space for their regular activities and gatherings. Eleanor listened carefully to this information, an idea slowly forming in her mind that would shape much of the estate's eventual purpose moving forward. She began discussing the possibility with Marcus of formally offering the rebuilt East Wing as a permanent space for the community center's activities, effectively fulfilling the estate's original historical purpose, while also honoring Richard's own quiet connection to local community service during his lifetime. The idea excited her more than anything else throughout the entire restoration process so far, giving deeper meaning to months of exhausting physical and emotional labor. She envisioned the space filled with local gatherings, classes, celebrations, and connections that would breathe genuine life back into a property that had spent years trapped in isolation and neglect. Standing one evening near the newly completed East Wing, watching the last rays of summer sunlight stream through its large windows, Eleanor felt a profound sense of accomplishment settling over her. The house that had once represented pain, legal battles, and family resentment was slowly transforming into something entirely different, a place of genuine purpose and community connection that honored both Richard's memory and her own journey toward reclaiming her sense of self after years of feeling invisible within a family that never truly valued her. Marcus joined her in that quiet moment, both of them standing together in comfortable silence, watching the light shift across newly restored stone and glass. Whatever challenges remained ahead, Eleanor felt increasingly confident that she was building something worth every difficult step it had taken to get here. The community meeting Eleanor organized to discuss the future of the rebuilt East Wing drew a larger crowd than she anticipated, filling nearly every folding chair set up within the newly finished space. Lucy Bennett stood near the front, beaming with obvious pride as she introduced Eleanor to several longtime residents who had known the Ashford family for decades, many sharing stories Eleanor had never heard before about Richard's quiet contributions to the town over the years. An elderly man named Henry Whitfield, no relation to Henry Cole the inspector, stood up during the discussion to share a memory of Richard organizing a fundraiser decades earlier to help rebuild the town's small library after a fire had damaged much of its original structure. Another woman recalled Richard quietly paying for medical bills for a struggling family during a particularly harsh winter, never asking for recognition or repayment. Eleanor listened to these stories with growing emotion, understanding more deeply with each passing account just how significant Richard's presence had been within this community. Despite how disconnected his own children had grown from that same spirit of generosity and care, she found herself sharing a few of her own memories as well, describing quiet afternoons on the porch, conversations about books and gardening, small moments that had meant more to her during a difficult marriage than anyone in the Ashford family had ever fully understood. By the end of the meeting, an overwhelming majority of attendees expressed enthusiastic support for Eleanor's proposal to offer the space permanently to the community center, along with additional suggestions for how the space might be used throughout different seasons, from holiday gatherings to educational workshops for local children. Eleanor left that meeting feeling a depth of belonging she had not expected to find in this town, a place she had once associated almost entirely with painful memories from her failed marriage. Marcus, who had attended quietly near the back of the room throughout the discussion, walked with her afterward toward her car, both of them reflecting on the unexpected warmth of the evening. News of the community meeting eventually reached Nathaniel, sparking what would become the most significant confrontation between them since the legal battle had concluded months earlier. He arrived unannounced at the estate one afternoon, parking his car aggressively close to the front entrance before storming toward the porch, where Eleanor happened to be reviewing paperwork with Marcus nearby. His tone carried none of the careful legal language his lawyers had used during the earlier court proceedings. Instead, raw frustration spilled out immediately, accusing Eleanor of turning his family's legacy into what he called a public spectacle, opening private family history to strangers and community gossip rather than respecting the privacy his father would have wanted maintained. Eleanor remained calm, despite the aggressive energy radiating from him, asking pointedly when exactly he had last spoken with his father, before assuming he understood what Richard would have actually wanted for this house. Nathaniel faltered slightly at the question, clearly caught off guard by her directness. She continued, her voice steady but firm, finally addressing years of resentment she had carried silently throughout their marriage and the ensuing legal battle. She reminded him of countless family gatherings, where he had dismissed her presence entirely, conversations where his siblings had spoken over her, as though she were invisible, and the isolation she endured throughout their marriage, while he remained consistently absent, prioritizing work and social status over any genuine connection with her, or, ironically, with his own father. Nathaniel's expression shifted through several emotions during her response, defensiveness giving way briefly to something that looked almost like genuine discomfort as her words landed with obvious accuracy. He attempted to redirect the conversation back toward the estate itself, insisting that regardless of past family dynamics, the house still represented generations of Ashford history that deserved to remain private, rather than opened up for community use. Eleanor met his eyes directly, sharing something she had not yet told anyone outside of Victor Hale and Marcus, information from Richard's private letter that she had kept close throughout the entire ordeal. She told Nathaniel plainly that his father's final written words had specifically addressed the pattern of entitlement he witnessed growing within his own children over the years, expressing genuine sadness at watching values around generosity and community connection fade from a family that had once embodied those principles fully. The words visibly struck something within Nathaniel, his aggressive posture faltering slightly as he processed this information. For a brief moment, Eleanor saw something resembling genuine vulnerability beneath his usual defensive anger, a flicker of the same guilt Edward had expressed to her weeks earlier. However, that vulnerability quickly hardened again into familiar defensiveness. Nathaniel insisted that regardless of whatever his father wrote in a moment of confused sentimentality near the end of his life, the practical reality remained that Eleanor had taken something that rightfully belonged to his family, and no amount of community goodwill or charitable gestures could change that fundamental fact. Eleanor, refusing to back down, responded with quiet clarity that the house belonged to her now, legally and rightfully, based on decisions Richard made with full mental clarity, decisions that had already been thoroughly examined and upheld by the court system months earlier. She told him firmly that she had no intention of apologizing for choosing to honor his father's memory in a way that brought genuine value back to this community, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth remained for him personally. Marcus, who had remained silently supportive nearby throughout the confrontation, stepped forward slightly, his presence a quiet reminder to Nathaniel that Eleanor was not alone in this fight, nor vulnerable to intimidation the way she may have once been during their marriage years earlier. Nathaniel, recognizing the shifting dynamics before him, finally turned to leave, though not before delivering one final bitter remark, suggesting that Eleanor would eventually regret opening up private family matters to public scrutiny, that she would soon discover just how quickly community goodwill could turn against her once people grew tired of the novelty surrounding her situation. Eleanor watched him drive away, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions settling over her once the confrontation ended. Relief, certainly, at finally voicing years of unspoken frustration directly to the person responsible for much of her earlier pain, but also a lingering unease at his parting words, wondering privately whether any part of his prediction might eventually prove true. Marcus, noticing her troubled expression, gently reassured her that Nathaniel's words carried more bitterness than truth, reminding her of the overwhelming support she had witnessed firsthand during the community meeting just days earlier. He pointed out that people like Lucy Bennett, Henry Whitfield, and countless others clearly recognized genuine sincerity when they saw it, something Nathaniel himself seemed entirely incapable of understanding, given his own detached relationship with authentic community connection. Despite Marcus's reassurance, Eleanor found herself reflecting deeply on the confrontation over the following days, examining her own motivations honestly to ensure she was pursuing this path because it genuinely felt right, rather than simply as a means of proving something to a family that had spent years dismissing her worth. She spoke at length with Grace about the encounter, walking through every detail of the confrontation and her own complicated feelings surrounding it. Grace listened carefully before offering perspective that helped settle much of Eleanor's remaining doubt. She pointed out that genuine, selfless actions rarely feel entirely comfortable in the moment, especially when they directly challenge people who benefit from maintaining old patterns of entitlement and control. Grace reminded her gently that the discomfort Eleanor felt following Nathaniel's visit likely stemmed less from any actual wrongdoing on her part, and more from years of conditioning within her marriage that had taught her to associate any assertion of her own needs or values with eventual punishment or abandonment. That perspective settled something deeply within Eleanor, helping her recognize more clearly than ever before just how much personal healing had already taken place throughout this entire journey, separate entirely from the physical restoration happening simultaneously to the house itself. In the weeks following the confrontation with Nathaniel, restoration work continued steadily, the rebuilt East Wing finally reaching full completion just as autumn began settling over the region. Eleanor formally finalized arrangements with the local community center, offering the space through a simple, informal agreement that allowed regular use of the wing for gatherings, classes, and events throughout the year. The first official event held within the newly completed space took place on a crisp autumn evening, a modest gathering organized by the community center to celebrate the completion of their new permanent home. Eleanor stood near the entrance that evening, watching dozens of local residents fill the space with warmth, conversation, and genuine joy, feeling an overwhelming sense of fulfillment that outweighed every difficult moment endured throughout the restoration process. Marcus stood beside her throughout much of the evening, their hands occasionally brushing together as they moved through the crowd, their growing connection now openly acknowledged between them. Though still developing at a careful, comfortable pace, neither felt rushed by external pressure to define more concretely than necessary. As the evening wound down, Lucy Bennett approached Eleanor one final time, thanking her personally for giving this community something Richard himself would have been immensely proud to witness. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she had recently heard through mutual acquaintances that Nathaniel's earlier warnings about community goodwill fading had, in fact, done the opposite entirely, sparking increased local support and admiration for Eleanor's efforts rather than the backlash he had predicted. Eleanor smiled genuinely at this news, feeling a quiet satisfaction that required no further confrontation or justification. The community itself had spoken clearly through their overwhelming support, offering an answer to Nathaniel's bitter predictions, far more powerful than anything she could have said in response herself. Standing later that night on the newly restored porch, watching the last guests depart down the freshly repaired driveway, Eleanor felt the weight of months of struggle finally settling into something resembling peace. The house behind her, once crumbling and forgotten, now stood as a living testament to resilience, community, and the quiet power of choosing generosity over bitterness, exactly as Richard himself had once hoped it would. Winter arrived quietly that year, settling a soft layer of frost across the estate grounds as restoration work shifted focus toward interior details throughout the main house. With the structural concerns largely resolved and the East Wing fully operational within the community, Eleanor found herself with slightly more breathing room than she had experienced in nearly a year, though new challenges continued surfacing in unexpected ways. Charlotte reached out during this period, her message arriving late one evening, without warning, after months of relative silence following the earlier legal battle. Unlike her previous communications, this message carried a noticeably different tone, less accusatory, and more hesitant, almost uncertain of itself. Charlotte explained that she had recently gone through a difficult separation from her own husband, an experience that had unexpectedly forced her to reconsider much of her earlier behavior throughout the entire estate situation. She admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that watching her own marriage collapse had given her a small but significant window into understanding some of what Eleanor might have experienced during her years within the Ashford family, though she stopped short of directly apologizing for her earlier accusations during the legal proceedings. Eleanor read the message several times, uncertain how to respond to this sudden shift in tone from someone who had caused genuine harm throughout the past year. She discussed it with Grace over dinner that evening, unsure whether to view Charlotte's message as a genuine attempt at growth or simply another manipulation tactic disguised as vulnerability. Grace, ever thoughtful, suggested that regardless of Charlotte's true intentions, Eleanor was under no obligation to respond in any particular way, nor was she required to offer forgiveness or reconciliation, simply because circumstances had shifted for Charlotte personally. She reminded Eleanor that healthy boundaries did not require harshness, but they also did not demand automatic acceptance of every apology or gesture offered after significant harm had already been caused. Eleanor ultimately decided to respond briefly, acknowledging Charlotte's message without offering the deeper reconciliation Charlotte may have hoped for. She wrote simply that she wished Charlotte well during her own difficult period, while making clear that rebuilding trust, after everything that had happened, would require far more than a single message, time, and consistent actions that Eleanor had yet to witness from any of the older Ashford siblings. Charlotte did not respond further after that exchange, though Eleanor occasionally heard through Edward that his sister seemed to be undergoing genuine personal reflection during this period, distancing herself gradually from Nathaniel's continued bitterness regarding the estate situation. Nathaniel himself remained largely absent throughout the winter months, though rumors occasionally reached Eleanor through various community connections. Apparently, his business dealings outside the estate situation had grown increasingly strained, financial pressures mounting from decisions he had made independent of the family inheritance dispute entirely. Eleanor felt no satisfaction hearing this news, though she also felt no particular sympathy, given his consistent lack of accountability throughout their shared history. Edward's visits continued steadily throughout the winter, his relationship with Eleanor deepening into something resembling genuine friendship rather than the cautious, tentative interactions that had characterized their first meeting months earlier. He began bringing his young daughter along during some visits, a bright-eyed child named Poppy, who quickly grew fascinated by the estate's gardens and the small greenhouse Eleanor had restored earlier that year. Watching Edward interact warmly with his daughter within these walls, Eleanor felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that at least one member of the next Ashford generation would grow up understanding the house, not through bitterness or entitlement, but through genuine connection and shared memories built on mutual respect rather than family obligation. Meanwhile, Eleanor's relationship with Marcus continued deepening steadily throughout the winter months, their connection growing naturally as restoration work slowed to a more manageable pace, allowing them more time to simply enjoy each other's company, beyond the pressures of construction deadlines and financial planning. They spent quiet evenings together in the newly restored parlor, sharing meals, conversations, and comfortable silences that Eleanor found herself treasuring more deeply than she had expected, given how recently her previous relationship had ended. One evening in late winter, Marcus arrived at the estate carrying something wrapped carefully in cloth, explaining shyly that he had been working on it privately during evenings away from the main restoration project. Unwrapping it slowly, Eleanor discovered a beautifully crafted wooden box, intricately carved with designs that mirrored architectural details found throughout the house itself, from the pattern along the staircase railing to subtle motifs visible in the restored stained glass windows upstairs. Marcus explained that he wanted to create something personal for her, separate from the professional restoration work itself, a symbol of everything they had built together over the past year, both within the house and between themselves personally. Eleanor felt genuinely moved by the gesture, recognizing the significant time and care invested into crafting something so deeply personal and thoughtful. Inside the box, she found a small collection of items Marcus had carefully saved throughout the restoration process, small fragments of original materials from the house that could not be preserved during construction, but held historical significance nonetheless. A piece of the original staircase railing, a small section of stained glass too damaged to restore fully, a fragment of stone from the collapsed section of the east wing before its reconstruction began. Eleanor held these small pieces carefully, understanding immediately the depth of thoughtfulness behind Marcus's gift, a physical representation of the house's journey from ruin toward restoration, carefully preserved rather than discarded, much like her own personal journey throughout this same period. That evening marked a quiet, significant turning point in their relationship, both of them acknowledging openly for the first time the depth of connection that had grown steadily between them throughout the challenging year they had shared together. Neither rushed toward grand declarations or dramatic gestures, choosing instead to continue building their relationship with the same patient, thoughtful care they had applied throughout the entire restoration process itself. As winter began giving way to early signs of spring, Eleanor turned her attention toward finalizing details for the main house's remaining restoration work. The grand staircase, nearly complete after months of careful reconstruction, stood as a visible symbol of how far the entire project had come since that first difficult exploration through debris and dust nearly a year earlier. Victor Hale reached out during this period as well, informing Eleanor that the appeal window for the Ashford family's earlier legal challenge had officially expired without further action taken, effectively closing the door on any future attempts to contest her ownership of the estate through legal means. This news brought a quiet sense of finality to the entire ordeal, confirming what Eleanor had already begun to feel emotionally over recent months, that this house, and the life she was building within it, truly belonged to her now, free from lingering threats or uncertainty. She celebrated this news modestly, sharing a quiet dinner with Marcus, Grace, and even Edward, who had become enough of a fixture in her life by this point, that including him in small celebrations felt entirely natural rather than awkward, given his family connections. During that dinner, Edward shared something that struck Eleanor deeply, admitting that watching her restore this house over the past year had taught him more about genuine resilience and integrity than anything he had witnessed within his own family throughout his entire life. He expressed gratitude, not just for allowing him continued access to childhood memories, but for demonstrating what it truly meant to honor someone's memory through meaningful action rather than empty words or inherited entitlement. Eleanor felt tears threatening as he spoke, moved deeply by his sincerity and the genuine growth she had witnessed within him throughout their unexpected friendship. She thanked him quietly, acknowledging that his own willingness to reconnect authentically, despite his siblings' continued bitterness, had meant more to her throughout this journey than he likely realized. As spring approached once more, nearly a full year after that first unexpected phone call from Victor Hale had upended her quiet, modest life, Eleanor found herself standing at the edge of the newly finished driveway one evening, watching the last light of day settle golden across the fully restored front facade of Ashford Hall. The house stood transformed entirely from the crumbling ruin she had first encountered, yet something about its restored elegance felt deeply connected to its original history, rather than simply erasing the past in favor of something new. It stood now as a bridge between what had been lost through years of family neglect and what had been rebuilt through genuine care, community connection, and quiet, determined resilience. Only one final step remained before Eleanor could truly consider this chapter of her journey complete, a decision she had been contemplating quietly for weeks, one that would mark the final, symbolic transformation of everything this house now represented moving forward. The idea had been sitting quietly in the back of Eleanor's mind for weeks before she finally decided to act on it. Standing at the iron gate one crisp spring morning, staring up at the engraved letters that still read Ashford Estate, despite everything that had changed within those walls over the past year, she felt a growing certainty that something needed to shift here as well, not out of spite toward the family name, but as an honest reflection of everything this property had become under her care. She brought the idea to Marcus first, explaining her thoughts carefully, as they walked together along the newly restored garden pathways one evening. She wanted to commission a new gate entirely, one that respected the historical craftsmanship of the original design, while replacing the family name with something that reflected the true ownership and transformation the estate had undergone. Marcus listened thoughtfully, understanding immediately the symbolic weight behind her request. He offered to help source a skilled ironworker, capable of matching the intricate detailing of the original gate, someone who could create something new that still honored the architectural integrity of the estate as a whole. Within days, Marcus connected her with a craftsman named Oliver Grant, an ironworker specializing in historical restoration projects, similar to the work already completed throughout the estate grounds. Oliver visited the property personally, studying the original gate's design carefully before sketching several potential concepts that maintained its elegant, timeless quality, while incorporating Eleanor's own family name into the design. Eleanor spent several evenings reviewing these sketches, ultimately selecting a design that preserved the gate's original decorative ironwork almost entirely, changing only the central lettering across the top, from Ashford Estate to Vance Manor, a name that felt both dignified and deeply personal, honoring her own journey, rather than simply replacing one family legacy with another borrowed identity. Before finalizing the decision, Eleanor felt compelled to speak with Edward directly, wanting to ensure he understood her intentions clearly, rather than allowing him to hear about this significant change secondhand through community gossip, or, worse, from his more bitter siblings looking to stir further conflict. She invited him to the estate specifically to discuss the gate change, sitting together in the newly restored parlor as she explained her reasoning carefully. She emphasized that this decision was not meant to erase his family's history from the property entirely, pointing out the numerous ways she had already worked to preserve meaningful elements throughout the restoration, from the original stone foundation incorporated into the rebuilt east wing, to smaller details like his father's favorite armchair, carefully cleaned and preserved rather than discarded. Edward listened quietly throughout her explanation, processing the news with visible thoughtfulness, rather than the defensive reaction she had half expected, given his family connection to the name being replaced. When she finished, he admitted that while there was a small, understandable pang of sadness at seeing his family name removed entirely from the gate, he ultimately understood and respected her decision completely. He shared, with quiet sincerity, that the true legacy of this house had never really been about the name displayed at its entrance, but about the values and care given to the people and community connected to it. In that sense, he told her, changing the name felt less like an erasure and more like an honest acknowledgement of who had actually earned the right to carry that legacy forward. His words settled something deeply within Eleanor, offering the final piece of reassurance she needed before moving forward confidently with the decision. She thanked him sincerely for his understanding, promising that he would always remain welcome on these grounds, regardless of whatever name eventually appeared above the gate. Word of the impending gate change spread gradually through the community over the following weeks, mostly through casual conversations, rather than any formal announcement. Reactions among locals remained overwhelmingly positive, many expressing that the change felt like a natural and fitting conclusion to the incredible transformation they had witnessed unfold throughout the past year. Not everyone reacted with such understanding, however. Nathaniel, upon hearing the news through mutual acquaintances, sent Eleanor a lengthy, bitter message, expressing outrage at what he considered the final, definitive erasure of his family's legacy from a property that had belonged to the Ashfords for 4 generations before her involvement. Eleanor read his message calmly, feeling none of the anxiety or defensiveness that similar messages from him might have triggered earlier in this journey. She responded briefly, reminding him plainly that the legal ownership of the estate had already been settled definitively months earlier, and that his father's own written words, along with his complete absence from Richard's life during his final years, spoke far more honestly about who truly upheld the family's meaningful legacy than any name displayed on a gate ever could. She did not expect, nor receive, any further response from him following that message, a silence that felt less like victory and more like simple, peaceful closure to a chapter of conflict she no longer needed to carry forward with her. As Oliver Grant's team began the careful process of crafting the new gate, Eleanor found herself reflecting deeply on the entire journey that had led her to this moment. She thought often about that first frightened phone call from Victor Hale, the exhausting legal battle that followed, the overwhelming task of restoring a house that had seemed beyond saving, and the unexpected connections formed along the way, from her growing relationship with Marcus to the surprising friendship developed with Edward, despite everything that initially separated them. She thought, too, about Richard himself, the quiet man who had seen something worth investing in during a period of her life when she had felt largely invisible and unworthy of genuine care. She hoped, standing now at the threshold of this final symbolic transformation, that he would recognize in this decision not a rejection of his family's history, but a genuine continuation of the values he himself had clearly hoped to see carried forward through the property he loved. The installation of the new gate took place on a bright morning in late spring, almost exactly 1 year after Eleanor had first stood outside these same iron bars, staring hesitantly down an overgrown driveway toward a house she barely recognized as anything worth saving. Oliver's team worked carefully throughout the morning, removing the old gate section by section before installing the newly crafted replacement, its polished ironwork gleaming beautifully in the late morning sunlight. Eleanor stood watching the entire process alongside Marcus, Grace, and even Edward, who had specifically requested to be present for this significant moment, despite the complicated emotions it clearly stirred within him regarding his family's legacy. As the final section of ironwork clicked securely into place, revealing the elegant new lettering spelling out Vance Manor across the top of the gate, a quiet, meaningful silence settled over the small gathering. Eleanor stepped forward slowly, running her fingers gently across the newly installed letters, feeling an overwhelming mixture of emotions rise within her. Pride, relief, gratitude, and something deeper still, a profound sense of having genuinely reclaimed her own identity, after years of feeling erased and dismissed within a family that had never truly valued her presence. Grace squeezed her shoulder gently, offering quiet, wordless support as tears gathered unexpectedly in Eleanor's eyes. Marcus stood close beside her, his hand finding hers naturally, a comforting presence throughout this deeply significant moment, marking the culmination of an entire year's worth of struggle, growth, and quiet, determined transformation. Edward, standing slightly apart from the others, offered a small, genuine smile as he studied the new gate himself. He admitted quietly that despite the complicated feelings still present within him, seeing the name change felt right somehow. A fitting conclusion to everything Eleanor had built here through sheer determination and genuine care, qualities his own family had sorely lacked throughout recent generations. Standing together at the newly transformed entrance to what was now officially known as Vance Manor, Eleanor felt the final threads of her old identity, the discarded, invisible wife within the Ashford family, fully unravel and fall away, replaced by a stronger, more confident sense of self she had built entirely through her own effort and resilience over the course of this extraordinary year. As the small gathering slowly dispersed that afternoon, each person offering warm congratulations before heading their separate ways, Eleanor remained behind a while longer, standing alone at the gate, watching the late afternoon sunlight catch beautifully across the newly polished ironwork, spelling out her own name for the very first time. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, she felt ready to face them fully as herself, no longer defined by the family she had once married into, but by the genuine strength, resilience, and quiet determination she had discovered fully within herself throughout this remarkable journey of restoration, both of the house and of her own sense of worth and identity. The morning of the grand reopening arrived bright and clear, the kind of early summer day that seemed almost deliberately chosen to showcase Vance Manor at its absolute finest. Eleanor woke early, standing at her bedroom window, overlooking the newly landscaped gardens below, watching soft golden light spread slowly across grounds that had been nothing but tangled ivy and broken stone just 1 year earlier. She had spent the previous week preparing carefully for this event, a modest but meaningful celebration meant to formally introduce the fully restored estate to the wider community, alongside official recognition of the ongoing partnership between the manor and the local community center, now permanently housed within the rebuilt East Wing. Grace arrived early that morning to help with final preparations, joining Eleanor in the newly restored kitchen as they organized refreshments for the growing number of guests expected throughout the day. Their conversation flowed easily, filled with reflective moments about how far Eleanor had come since that very first, terrifying phone call from Victor Hale, exactly 1 year earlier. Marcus arrived shortly after, along with several members of his original construction crew, who had been specifically invited to witness the completed results of their extensive work throughout the past year. Their pride was evident as they walked slowly through the finished house together, pointing out specific details they had personally restored, from delicate stained glass windows to the elegant, fully repaired staircase, now serving as the beautiful centerpiece of the main entrance hall. Edward arrived later that morning with his daughter Poppy, both dressed cheerfully for the occasion, Poppy immediately running toward the garden to visit her favorite section near the restored greenhouse. Edward smiled warmly as he greeted Eleanor, admitting that despite everything complicated about his family's history here, he felt nothing but genuine excitement witnessing this celebration unfold. As late morning approached, guests began arriving steadily, filling the newly restored grounds with lively conversation and laughter. Lucy Bennett arrived among the earliest guests, embracing Eleanor warmly, before immediately launching into an enthusiastic conversation with several other community members about upcoming events planned within the newly completed community space. Henry Whitfield arrived shortly after, sharing yet another story about Richard's quiet generosity throughout the years, adding to the growing collection of memories Eleanor had gathered from the community regarding the man who had ultimately made this entire journey possible through his final, unexpected act of kindness toward her. Throughout the early afternoon, Eleanor moved comfortably among her guests, feeling a genuine sense of belonging within this community that had embraced her so warmly throughout the difficult restoration process. She found herself repeatedly overwhelmed by the outpouring of support and genuine affection displayed by people who, just over a year earlier, had known her only as a controversial outsider, caught in a contentious inheritance battle. The formal portion of the celebration began in the early afternoon, with Eleanor invited to speak briefly, before the assembled crowd gathered comfortably throughout the newly finished East Wing. Standing before the group, she felt a nervous flutter in her chest, though nothing compared to the anxiety she had experienced throughout the earlier legal battles and uncertain early days of restoration work. She began her remarks by thanking the community for their unwavering support throughout the entire process, acknowledging specifically Lucy Bennett's early encouragement, Henry Whitfield's cherished memories of Richard, and the collective enthusiasm that had transformed her initial, uncertain vision into a genuine community resource now fully realized. She spoke next about Marcus, expressing heartfelt gratitude for his skill, patience, and unwavering dedication throughout months of challenging restoration work, acknowledging openly the personal relationship that had grown naturally alongside their professional partnership, drawing warm smiles and gentle applause from those gathered who had witnessed their connection developing steadily throughout the year. She acknowledged Edward as well, expressing genuine appreciation for his willingness to bridge difficult family history with authentic personal growth, offering a model of reconciliation and understanding that stood in stark contrast to the bitterness displayed by other members of his family throughout this journey. Finally, she turned toward the subject of Richard himself, her voice growing softer and more reflective as she described the quiet, unexpected kindness he had shown her during a period in her life when she had felt largely invisible and unworthy of genuine care. She shared, for the first time publicly, the crossed-out line she had discovered in his early draft of the will, expressing his belief that she had shown him more genuine kindness in return than his own children had offered throughout his final years. She explained that restoring this house had never truly been about proving anything to the Ashford family, nor about claiming an inheritance she felt entitled to. Instead, it had become a journey of honoring genuine kindness through meaningful action, transforming a symbol of family neglect into something that could serve an entire community moving forward, exactly as Richard himself had quietly envisioned decades earlier through his own father's original journals. As she concluded her remarks, the assembled crowd applauded warmly, many wiping away genuine tears, inspired by her heartfelt words. Marcus stepped forward afterward, taking her hand gently, as they walked together toward the newly unveiled plaque, commissioned specifically for this occasion, mounted prominently near the entrance of the community space within the East Wing. The plaque, crafted by Oliver Grant to match the elegant ironwork of the new gate, read simply that this space was dedicated in loving memory of Richard Ashford, a man whose quiet generosity and genuine care for his community inspired its restoration and continued purpose moving forward. Beneath his name, a smaller inscription noted that the space remained dedicated to serving the community he cherished throughout his life, a fitting tribute that honored his memory without erasing the complicated family history connected to the estate entirely. Edward, standing quietly beside his daughter as the plaque was formally unveiled, wiped tears from his eyes, expressing quiet gratitude that his father's memory would be honored in such a meaningful, lasting way, regardless of the complicated family dynamics that had unfolded throughout the past year. As the celebration continued into the late afternoon, Eleanor found herself standing once more near the newly installed gate, watching guests slowly begin their departure as the day wound down naturally into a peaceful evening. Marcus joined her there, both of them reflecting quietly on the incredible transformation this single year had brought into both their lives. He asked her gently, watching the golden evening light settle across the elegant ironwork spelling out Vance Manor above them, whether she felt satisfied with everything this journey had ultimately brought her, considering how frightening and uncertain its earliest days had once seemed. Eleanor considered his question carefully before answering honestly. She admitted that she could never have imagined, standing frightened and uncertain during that very first phone call from Victor Hale, that this journey would ultimately lead her toward rediscovering her own strength, building genuine community connections, restoring a meaningful piece of local history, and finding unexpected love and partnership along the way as well. She turned to face him fully, expressing quiet gratitude not just for his skill and dedication throughout the restoration process, but for his patient, genuine support throughout her own personal journey of healing and self-discovery during this same period. As the sun finally set completely behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the peacefully restored grounds of Vance Manor, Eleanor felt a deep, settled sense of peace she had not experienced in years, perhaps not since long before her difficult marriage had begun eroding her confidence and sense of self-worth. She thought once more, briefly, of Richard, silently thanking him for the unexpected gift he had given her, not merely a house, but an opportunity to rebuild her entire life, on terms entirely her own, free from the expectations and dismissiveness she had endured for far too long within his family. Standing there quietly beside Marcus, as evening settled fully over the beautifully restored estate, Eleanor finally allowed herself to fully embrace the depth of everything she had built here. Not just a restored house, but an entirely renewed sense of identity, purpose, and genuine belonging within a community she had grown to love deeply throughout this remarkable year of transformation. The gate behind them gleamed softly in the fading light, her own name etched proudly above the entrance, a lasting symbol of everything she had reclaimed through quiet resilience, genuine kindness, and an unwavering refusal to let others define her worth or her future ever again.